They had billions. They thought they were untouchable, but one man brought them all to their knees. The fall of the Soviet Union not only reshaped borders, but also redefined power, money, and influence in Russia. In this new world, the oligarchs rose like titans, and Vladimir Putin emerged as the man who would both use and control them. But to truly understand Putin's rise and the dangerous grip he holds over Russia and its wealthy elite, one must look deeper into the roots of power, the shadows of betrayal, and the machinery of a state rebuilt in his image. For the Russian people, the 1990s were a time of chaos. Ordinary families struggled to afford bread, while a handful of men seized entire industries. The streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg became hunting grounds for rival gangs and businessmen who operated more like warlords than entrepreneurs. The collapse of communism promised freedom, but what came instead was lawlessness, a jungle where only the most ruthless survived. It was in this jungle that Putin, a man shaped by the KGB, sharpened his instincts. He learned that loyalty was currency, silence was survival, and fear was the most effective weapon of control. Unlike the flamboyant oligarchs who flaunted their wealth on yachts and football clubs, Putin preferred a different image: disciplined, mysterious, untouchable. But behind this carefully crafted exterior, he built a system of patronage that bound the oligarchs to him. They could keep their billions, but only under his watchful eye. Anyone who dared to step outside the boundaries, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, paid the ultimate price. The message was clear. In Putin's Russia, you could be rich, but you could never be more powerful than him. This system of controlled wealth extended beyond Russia's borders. London became known as Londongrad, a playground where Russian fortunes purchased luxury mansions, fine art, and political influence. In New York, Miami, Paris, and the south of France, Russian oligarch money flowed like a river. But with that money came whispers of corruption, of hidden connections to the Kremlin, and of fortunes built on blood and betrayal. As Putin consolidated power, his reach extended far beyond Russia. Wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and later Ukraine weren't just military campaigns. They were displays of dominance, meant to show both his people and the world that Russia, under his command, was no longer weak. The oligarchs, meanwhile, were forced to play their role, fund his projects, keep quiet about corruption, and show public loyalty. And so, a dangerous balance was maintained. A ruler at the top, oligarchs beneath him, and a nation caught in the middle. Yet beneath this balance lies fragility. As sanctions target oligarch fortunes, as global scrutiny intensifies, and as war drains Russia's resources, cracks begin to appear. What happens when the billionaires who helped build Putin's empire begin to question whether their loyalty is worth the cost? What happens when fear is no longer enough to hold them in line? This is not just a story of one man. It is a story of a system where money and power intertwine, where silence is survival, and where betrayal can mean death. It is the story of modern Russia, its oligarchs, and the man who stands above them all, Vladimir Putin. The balance between Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs was fragile, but it was a balance nonetheless. It functioned like an unwritten pact: wealth in exchange for loyalty, survival in exchange for silence. For 2 decades, that pact held Russia together like iron chains. But the origins of Putin's power go back further, into the crumbling days of the Soviet Empire. As a young officer in the KGB, Putin was stationed in Dresden, East Germany. There, he witnessed firsthand the collapse of communism. He saw angry mobs storm government buildings, archives burned, and power slip through the fingers of men who once seemed untouchable. That collapse left a scar on him. To Putin, weakness was death, and he swore that when his time came, he would never allow Russia to crumble in such a humiliating way. Returning to St. Petersburg after the fall of the USSR, Putin was not yet the powerful figure he would become. He was just one man, surrounded by chaos. Factories were shuttered, workers went unpaid, and entire neighborhoods turned to crime. The so-called Wild 90s were dominated by mafia groups who shot rivals in broad daylight. Corruption became the norm. It was in this lawless environment that Putin found his way into politics, serving under St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak. Here, he gained something more valuable than money: connections. He learned how deals were struck in backrooms, how contracts could be traded for favors, how power could be bought and sold. For a man with the instinct to spy, this was fertile ground. By the late 1990s, Russia was drowning. President Boris Yeltsin's government was collapsing under corruption and public anger. The oligarchs, those who had seized oil, gas, and mineral industries during privatization, wielded more influence than the state itself. They owned television stations, newspapers, and entire regions of the economy. Some believed they could rule Russia from behind the throne, but they underestimated Vladimir Putin. When Yeltsin plucked Putin from obscurity and made him prime minister in 1999, many thought he would be a pliable figurehead, a man who owed his rise to the oligarchs and would serve their interests. They were wrong. Very quickly, Putin revealed a ruthless determination to consolidate power. He launched a brutal second war in Chechnya, demonstrating his willingness to use overwhelming force. He tightened control of the media, silencing critics and ensuring that television, Russia's most powerful propaganda tool, spoke with one voice, his. The oligarchs who supported him soon realized the new reality. If they supported him publicly, they could keep their empires. If they opposed him, they would be destroyed. The most dramatic example was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia. He dared to criticize corruption and fund opposition movements. In 2003, he was arrested on fraud charges, his oil empire dismantled, and his fortune stripped away. The spectacle was not just about punishing Khodorkovsky. It was a warning to every oligarch. Cross me, and you will be erased. Others, like Roman Abramovich, read the message clearly. Abramovich, who had built a fortune in oil and aluminum, aligned himself with Putin, even selling his prized oil company Sibneft to the state-owned Gazprom. In return, he was allowed to live a life of luxury abroad, buying yachts, football clubs, and palaces, so long as he never challenged the Kremlin. This system of managed wealth became Putin's signature model of governance. It was not just about economics, it was about loyalty. He became the arbiter of who could be rich, who could remain free, and who could fall. The oligarchs were billionaires, but Putin was something more, the man who held their futures in his hands. Meanwhile, for ordinary Russians, stability returned, but at a cost. The chaos of the 1990s faded, replaced by an authoritarian order. Wages improved, crime decreased, and Russia's pride, wounded by the collapse of the Soviet Union, began to heal. But the price was freedom. Independent media was crushed, opposition voices silenced, and dissent became dangerous. Internationally, Putin projected strength. He invaded Georgia in 2008, annexed Crimea in 2014, and launched military campaigns in Syria to showcase Russia's reach. These actions weren't just military operations. They were performances designed to remind the world that Russia was back and that Putin was its undisputed leader. Behind these moves, the oligarchs played their roles. They funded projects, built stadiums, and showcased Russia's wealth abroad. But they were always under surveillance. The Kremlin could seize their assets at any moment. In many ways, they were prisoners of their own fortunes. And yet, the deeper story lies in the psychology of power. Putin's rise was not only about silencing enemies. It was about reshaping the very idea of Russia itself. To his supporters, he restored pride, strength, and order. To his critics, he built a mafia state where loyalty mattered more than law, and fear was the ultimate currency. But history has shown that such systems, built on fear and control, do not last forever. Cracks are beginning to show. Economic sanctions have struck at the oligarchs' wealth. International isolation has weakened their ability to protect their fortunes abroad. Younger generations of Russians, raised in the digital age, are less willing to accept propaganda without question, and wars, costly and bloody, test the patience of a people who crave stability. The question now is not how Putin rose to power. That story is already written in history. The question is how long he can hold it, and what will happen when the balance finally breaks. The tale of Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs cannot be told without understanding each of the key players. The billionaires who once believed themselves untouchable and who soon discovered that they were merely pawns in a larger game. One of the first and most dramatic confrontations came with Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky was not just an oligarch. He was a kingmaker. In the 1990s, he controlled television stations, automobile industries, oil companies, and even airlines. He was a man who could pick up the phone and shape politics with a single call. When Boris Yeltsin's popularity collapsed in the late 1990s, it was Berezovsky who helped engineer Putin's rise, believing that this quiet, obedient ex-KGB man would be his puppet. At first, Berezovsky was right. Putin owed his ascent in part to Berezovsky's influence. But Berezovsky made one fatal mistake. He underestimated Putin's hunger for independence. Within a year of becoming president, Putin began cutting Berezovsky's influence. He demanded loyalty, not partnership. Berezovsky refused. He used his television channels to criticize the Kremlin, attacking government decisions and hinting that Putin was betraying democracy. Putin's response was swift. The state took control of the TV networks. Berezovsky's fortune began to collapse. He fled Russia, exiling himself in London, where he became one of Putin's fiercest critics. In 2013, he was found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was suicide. Many believe otherwise. This was the first signal to the world. Oligarchs who tried to challenge Putin directly would not survive. Another pivotal figure was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man. Khodorkovsky built his empire in oil during the privatization frenzy of the 1990s. He was intelligent, ambitious, and unlike many oligarchs, he wanted to modernize Russia's economy. He spoke about transparency, about Western partnerships, about making Russia a respected global economy rather than a mafia state. But this vision clashed with Putin's. Khodorkovsky also made the mistake of funding opposition parties, a red line in Putin's Russia. In 2003, at a televised meeting, Khodorkovsky confronted Putin directly, accusing him of corruption and of allowing state companies to steal from the people. Cameras rolled, the room froze, and Putin's cold stare locked onto him. That moment sealed his fate. Within months, Khodorkovsky was arrested on fraud and tax evasion charges. His oil giant, Yukos, was dismantled and absorbed by state-run Rosneft. The trial was broadcast across Russia, and the message was clear. Wealth did not make you safe. Power came from the Kremlin, not from money. Khodorkovsky spent a decade in prison, becoming a symbol of defiance. But his fall also transformed Russia's oligarch class. The others saw what happened and chose survival over resistance. They turned their attention to yachts, mansions, and football clubs, staying far away from politics. While Khodorkovsky and Berezovsky represented the fate of those who resisted, Roman Abramovich became a model of an oligarch who adapted. Abramovich's fortune was vast, built from oil and aluminum. But unlike the others, he never fought Putin. He aligned with him. Abramovich played the role of loyalist, even serving as governor of Chukotka, a remote Russian region, to demonstrate his usefulness. He sold his oil company, Sibneft, to the state at Putin's request, earning billions but losing independence. And yet, Putin allowed him to enjoy his wealth. Abramovich bought the Chelsea Football Club in London, becoming one of the most famous oligarchs abroad. He built super yachts longer than skyscrapers are tall. He purchased mansions across Europe. His life became a symbol of Russian wealth. But behind the glamour was a quiet truth. Abramovich's empire survived because he never crossed Putin. He lived in luxury, but always with a leash around his neck. Another figure worth noting is Oleg Deripaska, the aluminum king. Deripaska was one of the most aggressive oligarchs of the 1990s, involved in bloody battles for control of aluminum smelters during Russia's chaotic privatization. By the 2000s, he was one of Russia's richest men. He too understood the new reality. When the Kremlin needed him, he complied. When Western sanctions later targeted him, he became even more reliant on Putin's protection. For oligarchs like Deripaska, the arrangement was simple. Their wealth was enormous, but it was conditional. The Kremlin could give, and the Kremlin could take away. This system, which analysts often call Putin's vertical power, became the defining structure of Russian politics. It was built on three pillars. Loyalty of the oligarchs. Money could exist, but it had to serve the Kremlin's needs. Control of the media. No criticism could be allowed to undermine the image of stability. The use of fear, whether through prison, exile, or mysterious deaths, the consequences of disobedience were always visible. But power is never static. Even as Putin built his empire at home, he began projecting it abroad. Energy companies like Gazprom became tools of foreign policy, cutting or supplying gas to Europe as leverage. Oligarchs were encouraged to buy assets abroad, not just for profit, but as extensions of Russian influence. At the same time, Russia's wars, first in Chechnya, then Georgia, then Ukraine, became showcases of the state's dominance. Each war deepened Putin's authority, portraying him as a defender of the Russian nation. The oligarchs, in turn, funded reconstruction, sports events like the Sochi Olympics, and propaganda campaigns that highlighted Russia's return to greatness. Still, beneath the surface, tension simmered. The oligarchs enjoyed their wealth, but many feared losing it. They moved billions into Western banks, bought property in London and New York, and sent their children to elite schools abroad. Yet, the more they tied themselves to the West, the more they risked becoming vulnerable. When sanctions struck after Crimea, their fortunes shrank overnight. Their yachts were seized, their mansions frozen, their access to global markets cut off. For the first time, the oligarchs faced a dilemma. They had obeyed Putin for decades, but his geopolitical choices now endangered their wealth. Could they ever break free from his grip? And so, the story of Putin and the oligarchs is not just about wealth. It is about survival in a system where money means nothing without political loyalty. The Kremlin is the true bank, the true vault, and Putin is the banker, the jailer, and the judge. But this arrangement raises a haunting question. What happens when the man at the top is no longer there? Who inherits the keys to this empire of loyalty, fear, and wealth? The grip of Putin's power was not only forged in the gilded halls of Moscow's palaces or the oil-soaked hands of oligarchs. It was also tested and solidified on the battlefields. The Second Chechen War was one of the first proving grounds of Putin's leadership. When he came to power in 1999, Russia was humiliated, weakened, and bleeding from the First Chechen War, a conflict that had left the Russian military demoralized and the state appearing powerless. Putin made a calculated choice. He would win back control, no matter the cost. His language was brutal, promising to wipe out terrorists in the outhouse. It shocked many, but it resonated with a population desperate for strength and stability. The war in Chechnya was waged with devastating force. Cities like Grozny were reduced to rubble. Thousands died. Human rights groups condemned the atrocities. But within Russia, many saw something else. A leader who brought order to chaos, who restored the pride of the state. Putin's approval rating soared. The oligarchs watched carefully. They understood this was no weak caretaker president. This was a man who would use any means necessary to assert control, and who expected their loyalty in return. As the 2000s progressed, Putin's relationship with the oligarchs evolved further. Those who resisted had been crushed, Berezovsky exiled, Khodorkovsky imprisoned. Those who adapted, Abramovich, Deripaska, were allowed to thrive under strict obedience. But beyond these figures, a new class of elite began to emerge. The Siloviki, Putin's men from the KGB, the FSB, and the security services. This inner circle was not composed of businessmen who clawed their way up in the 1990s, but men bound to Putin through loyalty and shared pasts. Many of them had worked with him in St. Petersburg or in Soviet intelligence. Unlike the flashy oligarchs, these men were discreet, disciplined, and utterly dependent on Putin. Take Igor Second, often called the Darth Vader of Russian politics. Second was Putin's trusted deputy since his days in St. Petersburg. When Yukos was dismantled, it was Second's state company, Rosneft, that absorbed its assets. He became one of the most powerful men in Russia, controlling vast oil wealth, not because of entrepreneurship, but because of proximity to Putin. Then there was Gennady Timchenko, a close friend of Putin since the early 1990s. He built a fortune in oil trading through his company Gunvor. Western intelligence has long speculated that Gunvor was not only a business, but also a channel for Putin's personal wealth. Timchenko thrived because of his friendship with the president, and when sanctions later targeted him, he simply moved his operations to safer havens. These men, Second, Timchenko, and others like the Rotenberg brothers, Arkady and Boris, represented the new Russian elite. They were not oligarchs in the 1990s sense. They were custodians of Putin's system, entrusted with pieces of the state's fortune, loyal above all to the man at the top. Meanwhile, the old oligarchs adapted in strange ways. Many became cultural ambassadors of Russia abroad, investing in football clubs, luxury real estate, and Western companies. This was not just vanity, it was also a shield. By tying themselves to Western economies, they hoped to gain protection. If London or Paris depended on their investments, perhaps the Kremlin would not turn against them, and perhaps the West would not punish them either. But history would prove otherwise. In 2008, Russia went to war again, this time in Georgia. The brief but decisive conflict sent a message that Russia was back on the world stage as a military power. The oligarchs of Slovakia aligned once more, funding reconstruction projects, buying loyalty, and reinforcing Putin's narrative that he alone could restore Russia's greatness. And then came 2014. Crimea. The annexation of Crimea was the boldest move of Putin's career up to that point. It shocked the world, violated international law, and triggered the first major wave of Western sanctions against Russia's elite. For the oligarchs, it was a turning point. Many had built their lives around Western luxuries. Their children in Swiss boarding schools, their money in British banks, their yachts moored in Mediterranean ports. Suddenly, they were targeted. Their assets were frozen, their travel restricted, their companies blacklisted. Some panicked, others adapted. But one thing was certain. Their wealth was no longer safe outside of Russia. The West, which they once saw as a playground, had become a battlefield. And Putin? He tightened his grip. He reminded them that their survival depended not on London or New York, but on Moscow. The message was brutal and effective. You are nothing without me. As sanctions deepened after 2014, a strange paradox emerged. The oligarchs grew poorer by global standards, but more dependent on Putin than ever. Some secretly grumbled. Others dreamed of exile. But few dared act. For every Berezovsky who had fled, there was a cautionary tale of sudden death, mysterious illness, or violent accident. The story of Putin and the oligarchs was no longer just about Russia's internal balance of power. It was becoming a global saga. Western governments began asking, who really held the wealth? Was it the oligarchs themselves, or Putin through them? Investigations suggested that Putin's personal fortune might be hidden across the world, through friends, shell companies, and trusted loyalists. From palatial residences on the Black Sea to secret bank accounts, whispers of his wealth grew louder. But the truth was hard to pin down, because in Russia, wealth was not about ownership. It was about control. Putin did not need his name on documents. He did not need a bank account filled with billions. He had something more powerful, the ability to seize anything from anyone at any time. That was the true essence of his rule. And yet, questions remained. Could the system endure forever? What would happen when pressures from outside and inside began to collide? Could the oligarchs, long tamed and silenced, ever rise again? The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was not only a geopolitical gamble. It was a test of loyalty for Russia's elite. Overnight, the world changed for the oligarchs. Sanctions began striking with precision. Companies they had painstakingly built were suddenly locked out of global markets. Luxury properties in London and Paris, once symbols of untouchable wealth, became liabilities. Yachts were impounded, bank accounts scrutinized. For oligarchs who had treated Europe as their playground, the shock was profound. Some pleaded with the Kremlin to soften its stance, hoping the sanctions would ease. But Putin dismissed these concerns with cold indifference. To him, Crimea was not negotiable. It was a symbol of victory, a declaration that Russia was back as a great power. The oligarchs had two choices, bend or break. Most bent. Take Oleg Deripaska, the aluminum magnate. Sanctioned by the U.S. in 2018, his empire shrank, his fortune dwindled. Yet he never openly defied the Kremlin. He knew that survival meant obedience. Or Roman Abramovich, once the poster boy of Russian wealth abroad, with his Chelsea football club and sprawling real estate empire. He quietly sold assets, reshaped his profile, and distanced himself from politics. But he never turned against Putin. Loyalty, even in silence, was still loyalty. But not all fared so well. Some, like Boris Berezovsky, had long before chosen exile and opposition. Berezovsky paid with his life, found dead in mysterious circumstances in England in 2013. His fate became a warning. There was no safe distance from the Kremlin's reach. As Russia absorbed Crimea, Putin's domestic approval soared. For ordinary Russians, the annexation was framed as the restoration of historical justice. Crimea has always been ours, the propaganda declared. Television celebrated the victory with songs, parades, and endless praise for the president. National pride surged, even as the economy groaned under sanctions. The oligarchs, for all their grumbling, played along. They funded patriotic projects, sponsored cultural events, and echoed the Kremlin's narrative. The system held. But Crimea was just the beginning. In 2015, Putin made another bold move: military intervention in Syria. The Syrian civil war had dragged on for years, with Western powers struggling to find a coherent strategy. Putin saw an opportunity. By backing Bashar al-Assad, Russia positioned itself not only as a decisive force in the Middle East, but also as a challenger to Western influence. Russian jets bombed rebel positions, often indiscriminately. Cities were pulverized, civilians caught in the crossfire. Yet the intervention achieved its purpose. Assad's regime survived, and Russia emerged as a power broker in the region. For the oligarchs, Syria became another theater of opportunity. Russian companies sought contracts for reconstruction, oil, and trade. For the Siloviki, it was a chance to test weapons, to strengthen ties with Iran, to remind NATO that Russia could act far beyond its borders. And for Putin, it was a performance of power. At home, the message was clear. Russia was no longer on its knees. It was standing tall on the global stage. But beneath the triumphs, cracks began to spread. Sanctions tightened. The economy stagnated. Oil prices fluctuated, threatening the very lifeline of Russia's finances. Ordinary Russians felt the squeeze: rising prices, falling wages, shrinking opportunities. Protests flickered in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and provincial cities. Opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny began to gain traction, exposing corruption at the highest levels. For the oligarchs, this was dangerous terrain. On one hand, they owed everything to Putin. On the other, they were trapped in a shrinking world. Their assets abroad were unsafe, their businesses at home vulnerable to Kremlin raids. They were rich, yes, but increasingly powerless. Some whispered privately of discontent. Others quietly shifted assets to hidden havens, hoping to protect themselves. But open defiance was unthinkable. The memory of Khodorkovsky's imprisonment, of Berezovsky's mysterious death, still loomed large. Then came 2022. The invasion of Ukraine was the most dramatic and the most disastrous decision of Putin's career. Unlike Crimea, it was not a swift, bloodless annexation. It was a full-scale war, launched under the illusion that Kiev would fall within days. Instead, Ukraine resisted fiercely. The West responded with unity and speed. Sanctions of an unprecedented scale were unleashed. For the oligarchs, this was devastation. Billions in assets were frozen overnight. Yachts worth hundreds of millions were seized in Mediterranean ports. Villas in France and Italy were raided. Bank accounts in Switzerland vanished behind sanctions. Some oligarchs lost decades of accumulated wealth in weeks. The message from the West was blunt: Russia's war is your war, and you will pay for it. But inside Russia, the Kremlin's grip tightened further. Independent media was extinguished, opposition silenced, protesters jailed. The oligarchs, once symbols of excess and freedom, were now prisoners in gilded cages. Their wealth abroad was gone. Their survival at home depended entirely on loyalty to Putin. The Siloviki, Putin's true inner circle, grew stronger. Men like Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and Nikolai Patrushev, secretary of the Security Council, became central to the war machine. They were not businessmen. They were guardians of the state, men who thrived in conflict. And Putin himself? He appeared on state television, defiant, unmoved by sanctions, declaring that Russia would endure. But behind the spectacle, the reality was darker. The war dragged on, casualties mounted, the economy bled. The oligarchs, once untouchable, began to fall mysteriously. One after another, prominent businessmen linked to energy, banking, or defense were found dead. In mansions, in offices, in supposed suicides. The pattern was chilling. Were these coincidences or a silent purge? The truth remained murky, but the message was unmistakable. No one was safe. And yet the system endured. Fear kept it alive. Loyalty, forced, reluctant, or genuine, kept the oligarchs in line. Nationalism, fanned by relentless propaganda, kept much of the population subdued. But history is not static. Every empire, every regime, every ruler faces the same question. How long can power last when it rests on fear alone? The story of Putin and the oligarchs is not only about Russia's past. It is about its present and its uncertain future. As the war in Ukraine dragged into its first year, the world's eyes shifted not only to the battlefield, but also to the inner chambers of Russian power. For decades, the oligarchs have been the financial backbone of the state, the men who funded its projects, built its infrastructure, and served as global emissaries of Russian wealth. But now, many found themselves trapped in a paradox. Outside Russia, they were pariahs. Inside Russia, they were prisoners. Take the case of Roman Abramovich. Known to the world as the owner of Chelsea Football Club, Abramovich was perhaps the most westernized of all Russian oligarchs. His image was sleek, cosmopolitan, more celebrity than shadowy businessman. Yet when sanctions hit, he was forced to sell Chelsea under pressure from the British government. Overnight, he lost not only one of his most prized assets, but also a symbol of his global influence. Abramovich attempted something few others dared. He positioned himself as a mediator. In early 2022, during fragile peace talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul, Abramovich appeared at the negotiating table. It was an extraordinary sight, an oligarch, not a diplomat, acting as a bridge. Reports even emerged that he and other mediators had suffered symptoms of suspected poisoning during those talks. Whether true or part of the psychological warfare that surrounded the conflict, the incident showed how dangerous the game had become. Yet despite his efforts, Abramovich could not escape the tightening grip of sanctions. His yachts, his villas, his jets, all seized. In Russia, his wealth was tolerated. Abroad, it was erased. Others fared far worse. Oleg Tinkov, founder of Tinkoff Bank, did the unthinkable. He publicly criticized the war. In an Instagram post, he called the invasion insane and based on lies. His words spread like wildfire. For a brief moment, it seemed a new crack had opened in the wall of silence surrounding Russia's elite. But the response was swift. Tinkov was forced to sell his stake in his own bank at a fraction of its worth. His fortune evaporated, and he fled Russia, saying he'd been threatened with expropriation. His defiance was courageous, but it served as a cautionary tale. To criticize the war was to invite ruin. Then came the wave of mysterious deaths. Throughout 2022 and 2023, a chilling pattern unfolded. Wealthy businessmen tied to the energy sector were found dead, sometimes with their families, under circumstances labeled as suicides or accidents. Sergei Protasenia, former top manager at Novatech, was found dead in Spain, along with his wife and daughter. Vladislav Aveyev, a former Kremlin official turned Gazprom Bank executive, was discovered dead in Moscow, also alongside his family. Others fell from windows, died in sudden accidents, or were found lifeless in dachas and hotels. The message was clear. Wealth did not guarantee safety. Even proximity to power was no shield. For many Russians watching these stories unfold, it felt like a return to the darkest days of Stalin's purges, when powerful men vanished overnight. Meanwhile, the Siloviki, the men of the security services, rose higher. Unlike the oligarchs, their power did not depend on yachts or villas. Their power came from guns, prisons, and surveillance. In the war's atmosphere, theirs was the kind of power Putin trusted most. Figures like Nikolai Patrushev, head of the Security Council, and Alexander Bortnikov, head of the FSB, became pillars of the regime. To them, the war was not just about Ukraine. It was about survival against the West, about defending a fortress Russia from infiltration. Their worldview was stark, almost paranoid. The West was determined to destroy Russia, and only absolute control could prevent collapse. In this environment, businessmen who worried about sanctions or whispered of peace seemed irrelevant, even dangerous. Yet the war dragged on. Western sanctions grew harsher. Europe cut itself off from Russian gas, dismantling one of Moscow's strongest economic levers. Oil exports were rerouted eastward to China and India, but at discounted prices. Russia survived, but at a cost. Inside Russia, ordinary citizens bore the brunt. Imported goods disappeared. Inflation soared. Young professionals fled the country in waves, seeking safety abroad. Those who stayed behind faced new laws that criminalized dissent. Even using the word war could land a person in prison. And still, Putin tightened his grip. The oligarchs, once the rulers of Russia's post-Soviet capitalism, were shadows of their former selves. In public, they praised the president, funded patriotic projects, and spoke of resilience. In private, they lived in fear of sanctions, fear of arrest, fear of losing everything. Many quietly hoped the war would end quickly, that life would return to normal. But as months turned into years, that hope dimmed. The reality was sinking in. There would be no return to the old days. Russia was now isolated, and they were isolated with it. Yet Putin's calculation remained the same. He believed time was on his side. He believed the West would grow tired, divided, and distracted. He believed Russia's resilience, its vast land, its resources, its people hardened by history, would outlast sanctions. For him, survival was victory. But for the oligarchs, survival meant something different. It meant clinging to whatever scraps of wealth they still controlled. It meant proving loyalty, even when that loyalty came at unbearable cost. And it meant watching silently as the empire they helped build crumbled into war. Among the oligarchs, few embodied the contradictions of Putin's Russia more than Oleg Deripaska. Deripaska had once been the poster child of post-Soviet capitalism, a metals magnate whose empire stretched across aluminum, energy, and finance. At his peak, he was among the richest men in Russia, courted by Western governments and investors alike. Yet, his fortunes rose and fell with the tides of geopolitics. Sanctions imposed years earlier had already crippled parts of his empire, forcing him into humiliating negotiations just to keep his businesses afloat. When the war in Ukraine began, Deripaska made a calculated choice. Unlike Tinkov, who openly denounced the invasion, Deripaska spoke carefully. He criticized aspects of the war's economic fallout, but never directly challenged Putin. In one speech, he warned that Russia faced the worst crisis in 300 years. It had failed to adapt to the sanctions regime. His words were daring, yet cautious. They reflected the unease of an oligarch trying to balance survival with honesty. But in Moscow, even nuance could be dangerous. Deripaska's businesses came under pressure. His foreign assets were frozen. His once expansive global empire shrank. For a man who had built his wealth on international trade, the new Russia was a prison, and he was its captive. Then there was Alisher Usmanov, the Uzbek-born billionaire, once ranked among the richest in the world. Usmanov had built an empire in mining, telecom, and investments, and for years he enjoyed close ties to the Kremlin. He owned mansions across Europe, luxurious yachts, and sprawling estates until the sanctions came. In 2022, his 156-meter megayacht, Dilbar, one of the largest in the world, was seized by German authorities. It was a staggering blow, not only financially but symbolically. For decades, oligarchs had measured their power not just by the size of their companies, but by the size of their yachts. The seizure of Dilbar was more than an economic sanction. It was an act of humiliation. Usmanov, like others, withdrew into silence. His companies operated as best they could under sanctions, but the days of global expansion were gone. His loyalty to the Kremlin was no longer rewarded with untouchable status abroad. He was a titan confined to Russia's shrinking sphere. Mikhail Friedman represented yet another facet of this unraveling story. Born in Lviv, Ukraine, Friedman co-founded Alpha Group, one of Russia's most powerful private conglomerates. For decades, he cultivated an image of pragmatism, a man equally comfortable in Moscow and London. His investments spanned banking, telecom, and retail, and he lived in one of the most expensive mansions in the United Kingdom. But when war came, his Ukrainian roots turned his life upside down. He condemned the war in measured terms, calling it tragedy. Yet in Russia, that stance made him suspect. In the West, it was not enough to save him. Sanctions froze his accounts, restricted his travel, and left him in limbo. For a man who had thrived by being everywhere, he suddenly found himself belonging nowhere. His carefully crafted neutrality had crumbled under the weight of history. But perhaps no oligarch story captured the peril of speaking out more than Oleg Tinkov. Tinkov was not a traditional oligarch. He was a self-made billionaire in banking, with a flamboyant personality and a flair for Western-style entrepreneurship, unlike the shadowy figures of the 1990s. Tinkov built his wealth through consumer banking, appealing to the Russian middle class. He was, in many ways, an anomaly, a businessman who thrived without depending entirely on the Kremlin's favor. When the invasion began, Tinkov broke ranks. He called the war insane, denounced the crazy generals, and lamented the suffering of ordinary Russians. His words, posted on social media, were a shockwave. Rarely had a figure of his wealth and stature spoken so bluntly. The response was swift and brutal. Within weeks, he was pressured to sell his stake in Tinkoff Bank. He later revealed that he had been forced to sell it for a fraction of its value. Under threats from the Kremlin, stripped of his company, he fled Russia, declaring himself in exile. In interviews abroad, he spoke with rare honesty about the climate of fear within the elite. But his courage came at a price. In Moscow, his name became synonymous with betrayal. For other oligarchs, his downfall was a warning. Speak out and you will be destroyed. Meanwhile, the Kremlin turned increasingly to the Siloviki, the men of the security services, the generals, the spy masters, the enforcers. For men like Igor Sekin, the CEO of Rosneft and one of Putin's most loyal allies, the war was not a crisis but an opportunity. Sekin, nicknamed Darth Vader for his secrecy and ruthlessness, had long been a champion of state control over Russia's economy. As the oligarch's power waned, his influence grew. Rosneft became a vital tool for redirecting oil exports eastward, ensuring that Russia's war machine remained funded. Similarly, Nikolai Patrushev, the Security Council chief, rose to near mythical status within the Kremlin's inner circle. A fellow KGB veteran, Patrushev shared Putin's worldview of a hostile West determined to destroy Russia. He became one of the key architects of the war narrative, framing it as a civilizational struggle rather than a territorial conflict. These men did not measure power in yachts or villas. They measured in loyalty, secrecy, and survival. For Putin, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined, it was the Siloviki, not the oligarchs, who were indispensable. Yet, for all their strength, even the Siloviki could not shield Russia from the economic reality of sanctions. By 2023, Russia's GDP had shrunk, inflation soared, and technological imports slowed to a trickle. Microchips for weapons had to be smuggled. Luxury goods disappeared from store shelves. For ordinary Russians, life grew harder. For the oligarchs, life grew narrower. Their foreign bank accounts were frozen. Their children, once educated in London and Paris, were sent back to Moscow. Their estates abroad, symbols of their global reach, were seized. A new irony emerged. Men who had looted Russia to enjoy the West now found themselves confined to the very Russia they had once tried to escape. But still they endured, because they had no choice. Every oligarch understood the unwritten rule. Survival required loyalty. To distance oneself from Putin was to invite ruin. To betray him was to risk death. And so, in public, they smiled, they donated, they supported patriotic causes. In private, they grieved their losses, their freedom, their futures. The war had reshaped the balance of power in Russia. Once, the oligarchs had been the masters of wealth, holding sway over the Kremlin itself. Now, they were subordinates in a state where power flowed from a single man and from a security apparatus that guarded him. The shifting balance of power in Russia after the invasion revealed something long hidden beneath the surface. The oligarchs had never been true rulers, only instruments. The real architects of Putin's Russia were the Siloviki, the men of the services, whose loyalty had been forged not in boardrooms or stock markets, but in the corridors of the KGB, the barracks of the military, and the shadowy offices of the FSB. At the heart of this shadow state was Igor Sekin, the man often described as Putin's right hand. Sekin rarely appeared in public, rarely gave interviews, and cultivated an aura of silence that only magnified his power. Known in the West as the CEO of Rosneft, Russia's largest oil company. Second was much more than a businessman. To those inside the Kremlin, he was the Black Cardinal, the strategist who pulled strings behind the curtain. Second's story mirrored Putin's own. Both had served in Leningrad. Both had risen to the KGB ranks, and both had learned the art of loyalty in an era where betrayal meant ruin. As Russia faced sanctions, Second became indispensable. Rosneft redirected crude exports eastward, striking deals with China and India. Where oligarchs lost yachts, Second gained leverage. Oil revenues flowed into the war machine, and Second's grip on the energy sector tightened further. Then there was Nikolai Patrushev, perhaps the closest to Putin in worldview. If Putin was the face of the war, Patrushev was its voice in the inner sanctum. A career intelligence officer, Patrushev headed the FSB before becoming the powerful secretary of the Security Council. Cold, meticulous, and deeply suspicious, he represented the paranoid heart of the Russian state. Patrushev framed the war not as a conflict with Ukraine, but as a clash with the entire West. In his speeches and interviews, he spoke of a centuries-old plot to destroy Russia, portraying NATO, the EU, and the United States as existential enemies. This narrative resonated with Putin, who increasingly saw himself as a historical figure fighting to save his nation from collapse. For the oligarchs, men like Patrushev were dangerous. They had no interest in yachts, no vulnerability to Western sanctions, no ties abroad that could be cut. Their power was rooted in ideology, and their loyalty was absolute. In a Russia at war, that made them far more valuable than businessmen with villas in Spain. Another figure, Sergei Shoigu, embodied the militarization of Russian politics. As Minister of Defense, Shoigu had long cultivated the image of a patriotic strongman. Unlike many of Putin's allies, he was not from the KGB, but from the military establishment, with a reputation for loyalty dating back decades. Shoigu and Putin often appear together, fishing in Siberia, vacationing in remote forests, images carefully staged to present unity and masculinity. Yet Shoigu's real power lay in his command of the military apparatus. Even as Russian troops struggled in Ukraine, even as corruption in logistics was exposed, Shoigu remained in position, shielded by Putin's trust. For the oligarchs, Shoigu's endurance was yet another reminder of a new hierarchy. In the Russia of war, it was not businessmen who mattered, but generals. And then came the wild card, Ramzan Kadyrov, the warlord of Chechnya. Kadyrov was unlike any other figure in Putin's circle. Brash, flamboyant, ruthless, he styled himself as both a loyal vassal and a ruler in his own right. His private army, the Kadyrovtsi, acted not only in Chechnya but across Russia and Ukraine, enforcing loyalty and projecting terror. Kadyrov pledged undying loyalty to Putin, often proclaiming that he would die for him. But his methods, his brutality, and his growing influence unsettled many within the elite. For oligarchs, Kadyrov was a nightmare made flesh, a man outside their world of contracts and negotiations, who measured power in blood and fear. Together, these men, Second, Patrushev, Shoigu, Kadyrov, formed the steel spine of Putin's Russia. Where the oligarchs had once represented wealth, these figures represented control. And yet, even they were not untouchable. Corruption gnawed at the system from within. In 2023, reports emerged of embezzlement within the Ministry of Defense. Soldiers at the front complained of lacking basic equipment. Supplies meant for the battlefield vanished, sold on the black market. The oligarchs might have been weakened, but the same corruption that had defined Russia's post-Soviet years still thrived. Only now, it was cloaked in patriotism. Meanwhile, the mysterious deaths continued. Executives tied to Gazprom, Lukoil, and Novatek were found dead under strange circumstances. Some fell from windows, others were discovered hanging, still others poisoned. Each case was labeled suicide or accident, but the pattern was unmistakable. Among the most shocking was the death of Ravel Maganov, chairman of Lukoil, who reportedly fell from a hospital window in Moscow. Lukoil had been one of the few major Russian companies to call for peace early in the war. His death sent a chilling message. Dissent, even subtle, was intolerable. For oligarchs still alive, the message was clear: loyalty was not optional. Silence was not enough. Active support was demanded. By 2024, Russia had become a fortress state. Sanctions cut it off from Western finance, trade, and technology, yet the regime adapted. Trade with China deepened. Smuggling networks brought in banned goods. Factories shifted to war production. And amid it all, Putin's grip tightened further. The oligarchs, once symbols of Russia's wealth, were reduced to shadows, living in fear of both the West and their own government. Some tried to reinvent themselves as patriots, sponsoring state projects. Others quietly withdrew from public life, hoping obscurity would bring safety. But the balance of power had shifted forever. In Putin's Russia, money no longer bought influence. Only loyalty did. By 2024, Russia was no longer the country it had been just a few years earlier. The war in Ukraine had transformed it into something harsher, narrower, and more insular. The open windows to the West, the banks, the luxury goods, the flow of people, had been slammed shut. In their place, a fortress economy emerged, built not on prosperity but on survival. Factories that once produced cars now churn out armored vehicles. Civilian industries were converted for military purposes. Entire sectors shifted toward war production. Those who had made fortunes importing Western brands, luxury cars, electronics, clothing, found their businesses crumbling. In their place came a black market, where smuggled iPhones or German machine parts were sold at triple the price. For ordinary Russians, daily life grew increasingly difficult. Prices soared. Imported medicines became scarce. Supermarket shelves offered fewer choices, with Western products replaced by domestic imitations or Chinese imports. Yet state propaganda insisted that Russia was thriving, that it was becoming more self-sufficient, that the West's attempt to strangle the economy had failed. On television, anchors praised the resilience of the people. In reality, survival came at a cost, and it was the oligarchs, once symbols of extravagance, who paid it in silence. The oligarchs were forced to reinvent themselves. Some redirected their empires toward Asia, finding new partners in China, India, and the Middle East. They sold oil and metals at discounted rates, filling the state's coffers even as their own profits shrank. Others pivoted inward, funding domestic projects, sponsoring patriotic campaigns, and proving their loyalty through visible contributions to the war effort. Take Gennady Timchenko, one of Putin's oldest friends. A man whose fortune was built on oil trading, Timchenko adapted quickly. His companies focused on exports to Asia, securing deals that sustained Russia's energy revenue. He appeared in public as a model loyalist, praising the president's leadership and framing the hardships as a necessary sacrifice. For Timchenko, loyalty had always been profitable. His closeness to Putin insulated him where others faltered. But even he faced the shrinking reality of the new Russia. His villas abroad seized, his accounts frozen, his travel restricted. Other oligarchs fared far worse. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man before his imprisonment in the early 2000s, watched from exile as a country he had tried to reform descended deeper into autocracy. Speaking from London, he warned that Putin had built a system where loyalty, not law, determined survival. His words echoed across Western media, but in Russia, they were erased, censored as the rantings of a traitor. Mikhail Friedman, confined by sanctions in Europe, lived a different kind of exile, trapped not in a prison, but in a gilded cage. His assets frozen, his accounts monitored. He lived in limbo, unable to return to Russia, unwelcome in the West. For a man who had built his empire on being everywhere, he now belonged nowhere. The mysterious deaths, too, continued into 2024. The list of businessmen dying under bizarre circumstances grew longer. Executives tied to the energy industry, banking, and defense contracts were found lifeless in Moscow apartments, in foreign villas, in forests and rivers. Each case, on its own, might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a chilling picture of a class living under constant threat. It was not just about silencing dissent. It was about control. Fear became the glue of the elite. Inside Russia, society grew more militarized. Schools introduced patriotic education, teaching children about the glory of Russia's history and the righteousness of the current struggle. Universities purged professors who questioned the war. Journalists who once dared to criticize fled the country or faced prison sentences. The oligarchs watched all this unfold with unease. Many of their children had once studied abroad, living Western lifestyles. Now, those options were gone. Their sons and daughters were pulled back into a Russia they had never expected to live in, a Russia of propaganda, isolation, and suspicion. The irony was bitter. The very men who had siphoned Russia's wealth into London, New York, and Monaco were now trapped inside the fortress they had helped build. And yet, Putin's calculation appeared steady. He believed the West's unity would crack. He believed sanctions could be endured. He believed Russia's ability to mobilize resources, to control dissent, and to adapt would outlast the patience of his adversaries. His confidence was not without foundation. Despite sanctions, the Russian economy did not collapse. Oil and gas revenues continued to flow, redirected eastward. The ruble wavered but did not vanish. Life inside Russia grew harder, yes, but the state survived. And in Putin's logic, survival was victory. For the oligarchs, though, survival meant something darker. It meant losing the global lives they had built, watching fortunes evaporate, and existing at the mercy of a system that could turn on them at any moment. Yet in private, whispers persisted. Some oligarchs still dreamed of a post-Putin Russia, a time when they might recover their freedom and fortunes. Others resigned themselves to loyalty, calculating that aligning with the Kremlin was their only protection. But one truth was clear. The oligarchs were no longer the masters of Russia. They were its captives. By 2025, the transformation of Russia was undeniable. The nation that once flirted with the West, that dreamed of wealth, investment, and prestige on the global stage, was now something else entirely. A fortress state bound by fear, ideology, and the iron will of one man. The oligarchs, once the kings of this new Russia, had been broken, humbled, or exiled. Their yachts were seized, their villas confiscated, their children forced home. Men who once walked red carpets in London or New York now walked cautiously through Moscow's corridors, careful not to attract suspicion. For them, survival was no longer measured in billions, but in silence. Meanwhile, the Siloviki thrived. Igor II's Rosneft grew stronger as Russia deepened its ties to China and India. Nikolai Patrushev's doctrine of siege and paranoia became state policy, embraced not just by Putin, but by an entire apparatus that now viewed the West as an eternal enemy. Sergei Shoigu, despite battlefield blunders, remained a loyal soldier of the system, his survival proof of Putin's preference for loyalty over competence. And Ramzan Kadyrov, brash, flamboyant, and brutal, remained both feared and indispensable, a reminder that Putin's power was built as much on fear as on strategy. For the Russian people, life was harsher, narrower. Imported goods disappeared, replaced by cheaper substitutes. Travel abroad was no longer possible for many. The young, once dreaming of London, Paris, or Berlin, now faced a choice: adapt, resist, or flee into exile. Those who stayed endured a world of propaganda, where every billboard, every television channel, every speech reinforced the same message. Russia was besieged, and only unity behind a leader could guarantee survival. In this world, the oligarchs, once symbols of excess, became ghosts. Some whispered in exile, warning of collapse. Others stayed quiet, fearful of joining the long list of mysterious deaths. The era of men like Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, or Abramovich was over. The wealth remained, but the freedom was gone. And at the center of it all stood Vladimir Putin. From his days in the KGB, through his rise in St. Petersburg, through the Chechen wars, through the oligarch battles of the 2000s, through Crimea, through Syria, and now through Ukraine, his trajectory had been clear. Consolidation of power, step by step, until no rival remained. To his supporters, he was a defender of Russia, a man who restored pride and resisted humiliation. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a man who crushed freedom, enriched loyalists, and plunged his nation into endless conflict. But whatever one believed, one fact could not be denied. Putin had reshaped Russia in his own image. A Russia where wealth bowed to power, where loyalty mattered more than law, and where survival was the ultimate currency. And so, as Russia moved deeper into the 2020s, the story of the oligarchs served as both a warning and a symbol. They had believed their billions made them untouchable. They had believed that wealth meant freedom. But in Putin's Russia, wealth was nothing without loyalty, and loyalty was everything. Their story was a mirror for the nation itself. Rich in resources, powerful in potential, yet trapped by fear, control, and the ambitions of a man who refused to let go. This was not just the rise of Vladimir Putin. This was a story of a system built on loyalty and fear, a system where oligarchs fell, Siloviki rose, and an entire nation was bound to the will of one man. And the question that remains is not just about Putin or the oligarchs, but about Russia itself. How long can a nation live in the shadow of one man's vision? How long can loyalty replace law, fear replace freedom, and war replace peace? The answers may not come today, or tomorrow, but history has a way of forcing them, whether a nation is ready or not. Thank you for watching this journey through power, wealth, and fear in modern Russia. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the rise of Putin and the fall of the oligarchs? Share your perspective in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Zimo Voice for more powerful documentaries just like this one.